Every siege follows a pattern. It doesn't matter how many soldiers march or how formidable the artillery is. Every siege bets on a single certainty, that the resistance will break before the siege does. And it was that certainty he turned into a weapon. While 40,000 Ottomans surrounded the church fortress, confident in the arithmetic of war, something extraordinary was happening inside. It wasn't panic, it was engineering. The transformation began with strategy. He looked at the church not as a sacred place, but as a war machine. The structure had to become a living trap. The high windows of the nave became elevated firing positions. Archers placed there, protected by stone, covered the entire northern approach with concentrated fire. But he didn't stop there. The bell tower stairs were reinforced with beams. If the enemy broke in, each step would turn into a choke point. As a last resort, the beams could be pulled down to block access. Spaces between columns became defensive positions. Barricades created internal fortresses. If the enemy penetrated, they would find a sequence of fortified points, bleeding the attack's momentum meter by meter. Limitations became advantages. With few soldiers, he designed the defense to multiply their strength. Narrow corridors where one man counted as 5. Firing angles where 3 could do the work of 20. The church's geometry became his greatest ally. Supplies were allocated with surgical precision. Arrows distributed by priority. Water stored in separate locations. Food rationed from day one. And the trap was being built. But modifying the church was only the first layer. The true genius was in how he saw the surrounding environment. Because while the Ottomans saw only a strategic valley that gave access to Central Europe's trade routes, he saw an arsenal waiting to be activated. The geography of that place was not neutral. It never had been. The church sat on a subtle rise. Those extra meters gave visual and ballistic advantage to the defenders, while forcing attackers to climb exhausted and slow. And he turned that into science. Lines of sight were mapped with obsessive precision. From every firing position inside the church, the defenders knew exactly how far they could see, which angles were blind, where the terrain created shadows, and most importantly, they knew where the enemy would be forced to move. Because the ground didn't offer infinite choices. There were natural approaches, paths where the soil was firmer, where the incline was less steep. And on each of those routes, a surprise was waiting. Choke points were intensified. Stones and obstacles moved to channel the enemy where the defenders wanted. River crossings were studied. Depth, current, steep banks. Every vulnerability was mapped. The weather became an ally. It was a brutal winter. While the Ottomans froze in their tents, the defenders had the stone shelter of the church, protected from the wind and conserving warmth. Each cold wave that swept the valley weakened the besieging army. Soldiers who should have been resting spent the night shivering. Horses that should have been ready for battle woke stiff and slow. Weapons that should have fired accurately jammed with frost. And Stephen knew this. He counted on it. He turned the winter into an invisible soldier fighting at his side. But there was a problem no wall could solve. The math. 40,000 soldiers against a few hundred. Brutal force would eventually win. Unless Stephen had a card up his sleeve that defied logic itself. Unless ingenuity included deception. And this is where the defense became art. Deception had multiple layers. First, the illusion of weakness. Sections of the defenses looked poorly built, deliberate bait, positioned to force the enemy to cross zones of concentrated fire. Upon reaching the vulnerable point, they would find an internal fortification, having wasted men and morale on a mirage. Second, confusion about the numbers. The Ottomans didn't know the real number of defenders. Guards rotated in irregular patterns, fires were lit in different places. Uncertainty was planted. That uncertainty was poisonous. Enemy commanders began to doubt their own assessments. Maybe it wasn't so easy. Maybe they needed more preparation. Maybe the attack should wait. And every day of waiting was a day the winter did the work for them. Third layer, unpredictable timing. Active defenses were executed at strategic, not random, moments. When the Ottomans began to establish a routine, when they started to think they understood the besieged's behavior patterns, something unexpected happened. A sudden sortie by a small group of defenders for a quick raid. Concentrated arrow fire at a moment that seemed tactically nonsensical. Absolute silence when they should have been answering provocations. Each pattern break forced the enemy to recalibrate, to rethink, to lose faith in their own assumptions. And when you're commanding 40,000 soldiers in a frozen valley, far from home, besieging a fortress that should have fallen in 3 days, but still holds after 3 weeks, confidence is everything. It's what keeps an army from disintegrating. It's what maintains discipline. It's what separates a fighting force from a confused crowd. And Stephen was systematically destroying that confidence. But all that engineering, all that militarization of the environment, all that layered deception, it was only preparation. Theory waiting for the test of reality, and reality was about to arrive with absolute violence. Because 3 weeks after the siege began, the Ottoman commander made a decision. Enough. The cautions were over. 40,000 soldiers would carry out a massive assault. 5 simultaneous fronts, relentless artillery, waves of infantry until the defense broke. At sunrise, the defenders saw the end of the world. The whole valley was in motion. Thousands of soldiers forming attack formations, columns of smoke rising from cannons being readied. The sound of orders shouted in Turkish echoing between the slopes. The flash of steel under the weak winter light. And then, silence. That unnatural silence that precedes organized violence, when even the wind seems to hold its breath. And then, chaos. The artillery opened fire. Shells tore through the air, striking walls and making the earth tremble. Dust and deafening noise dominated everything. But the walls held. Because they had been reinforced exactly for this. Because every likely point of impact had been identified and fortified weeks before. And then the infantry came. Thousands of soldiers advancing in tight formation, shields raised, siege ladders being carried, battle cries piercing the air. The northern front received the first wave. 200 men running toward the walls, confident in numbers, confident in the inevitability of victory. And they found hell. Elevated positions opened fire. Arrows rained from unexpected angles. Soldiers fell before reaching the walls. Ladders were knocked down. The attack collided with an omnipresent defense. The second wave advanced. More soldiers, more ladders, more determination. And again, they were repelled. Not by superior force, but by superior geometry, by superior positioning, by defenders who knew exactly where each attacker would be, exactly when he would be vulnerable, exactly how to turn that vulnerability into defeat. The eastern flank tried next. That spot that looked weak, that section of the defenses that seemed poorly built. 300 Ottoman soldiers threw themselves in that direction, convinced that would be the breakthrough, and they fell right into the trap. The terrain funneled them into the kill zone. The weakness was a fortified bait, impossible to break without catastrophic losses, and they retreated. 3 fronts attacking simultaneously, 3 fronts repelled, hundreds of Ottoman casualties, and inside the church the defenders still held their positions, still controlled their sectors, still breathed. The plan was working, but at a cost. Arrows being consumed faster than planned. Wounded beginning to accumulate. Fatigue settling on the faces of defenders who had fought without pause for 2 straight hours. And out there, 40,000 soldiers still waited. The Ottoman commander watched the result of the first assault with growing frustration. This should have ended it. That handful of defenders should have been dead or surrendering. But they were not. They still resisted. They still held that damned church. And then he made the decision that would change everything. No more probes. No more careful tactics. In the next thrust, the full weight of the army would be thrown at once. 5 fronts at the same time. 10,000 soldiers in the first wave. Artillery firing until the walls crumbled to dust. An attack so massive that no ingenuity, no clever defense could withstand it. Because in the end, he believed in the simple math of war. And 40,000 will always defeat a few hundred. But he was about to make the bloodiest mistake of his career. And while the Ottomans reorganized for the final assault, while officers shouted orders and soldiers adjusted armor and sharpened swords, inside the church a different preparation was underway. Stephen walked slowly among the exhausted defenders. He looked at every face marked by soot and blood. He saw men who had pushed past their limits and were now facing the prospect of pushing even further. He saw eyes that knew what was coming, that understood the odds, that recognized the brutal math of war. And he saw no surrender. He saw something else. He saw men who had decided that that church would not fall. They simply would not allow it. And as the sun began to sink on the horizon, tinting the valley in orange and red tones that seemed to foreshadow the violence to come, as winter kept its silent watch over that battlefield, one question hung in the cold air. What would happen next would become legendary. Not because of the violence, though there would be violence. Not because of the numbers, though numbers mattered, but because of a church that refused to fall. Because of defenders who turned architecture into a weapon. Because of a strategist who saw what no one else could see. That every siege is a psychological wager. And that when you invert that psychology, when you turn the enemy's certainty into doubt, when you make 40,000 soldiers question whether they can really win against a few hundred, you are not merely defending a position. You redefine the meaning of victory. The final assault came at dawn. 40,000 against a single church. The mist cleared, revealing the Ottomans' last attempt. The drums of war echoed across the frozen plain as the Turkish troops formed into massive ranks. It was impossible not to feel the weight of that sight. Every defender knew this would be the decisive moment. Either Stephen's engineering would work perfectly, or they would all die within those walls. But something was different in this attack. The Ottomans had learned from earlier assaults. This time they brought reinforced ladders, mobile siege towers, and specialized urban combat units. Mehmed Pasha, the Ottoman commander, had studied every failure of the previous attacks. He knew the Moldavians had something prepared. He just didn't know exactly what. The trap was ready. All that remained was for the Ottomans to walk into it. The first waves advanced at 6 in the morning. Thousands of soldiers ran across the frozen ground toward the outer walls, the terrain Stephen had carefully prepared. During the night, the defenders had poured water over the approach routes. Now, with temperatures below freezing, those paths were sheets of pure ice. Ottoman soldiers began slipping, falling, tripping over one another. Organized formations dissolved into chaos before they even reached the walls. Mobile cannons on sleds were revealed. Silent, they opened fire from crossed angles when the Ottomans reached the walls, creating deadly zones. Stephen's genius was in understanding that a small force doesn't need to win head-on. It needs to make it impossible for the enemy to use its own strength. The Ottomans had 40,000 men, but could only send a few hundred at a time through the approachways, and each group that advanced encountered a new layer of defense. When the first Turkish soldiers finally scaled the outer wall, they thought they had gained something. Little did they know Stephen had designed that wall to be sacrificial. Inside, the Moldavian defenders waited, protected by a second line of fortifications. Barricades of wood, stone, and even wrecked wagons formed a deadly maze. Each corridor funneled to a death zone where archers could shoot from elevated positions without being exposed. The valley erupted into chaos. Ottoman soldiers met Moldavian infantry attacking head-on while smaller groups flanked them from the sides. The noise was deafening. Shouts of command in Turkish, the whine of arrows cutting the air, the crack of cannons on sleds being constantly repositioned. The Ottomans were fighting not just men, but the terrain itself that Stephen had turned into a weapon. By about 9 in the morning, Mehmed Pasha realized something terrible. His soldiers weren't just being defeated. They were being funneled. Every attack route that seemed promising led to a death zone. Every breach in the walls was actually a funnel that concentrated his troops exactly where the defenders wanted them. He was fighting an engineer who thought like a strategist. But Mehmed was a veteran of dozens of sieges. He still had numbers. He ordered a coordinated attack on 3 fronts simultaneously. If the Moldavians had prepared traps, he would force them to spread too thin. 40,000 men allowed that flexibility. Even losing thousands, he still had enough soldiers to crush the defense. Pressure on the defenders increased drastically. Stephen watched from an improvised tower, calculating. He had foreseen this. He knew the Ottomans would eventually use their one real advantage, sheer numbers. It was time to reveal the last layer of the trap. The inner walls of the church were not just walls. They were hollow structures filled with flammable materials and rubble. Stephen had left strategic openings where pots of fire could be poured. When the Ottomans finally broke the second line and began scaling the church walls themselves, the defenders unleashed literal hell. Oil, pitch, and heated stones rained down from unpredictable angles. Internal channels created curtains of flame along the walls, making any climb impossible. The turning point came at 11 in the morning. An elite Ottoman unit, the Janissaries, managed to breach a real gap in a side section of the church. For a terrifying few minutes, it looked like the defense would finally be broken. 50 of the Empire's best soldiers were inside the final perimeter. They discovered the last innovation. The interior was a maze of compartments. Janissaries were isolated into small groups and met by defenders with axes and spears in close combat. The fighting was brutal and quick. The Janissaries were exceptional warriors, but they were fighting in terrain completely controlled by the enemy. No room to maneuver, no clear view of the battlefield, unable to use their tactical discipline. In less than 10 minutes, all 50 were dead or captured. When Mehmed Pasha received the news, something inside him broke. He had sent his best men. They had managed to penetrate the final defense, and yet they had been annihilated. In that moment, he understood the devastating truth. It didn't matter how many soldiers he had. That church was a living fortress that adapted to every attack. Each section had been designed to neutralize different kinds of threats. The Ottomans kept attacking until mid-afternoon, not in the hope of victory, but because retreating from a siege would be admitting total defeat. But with each passing hour, morale plummeted. Soldiers began to hesitate before advancing. Officers had to force the troops to attack. Fear spread through the ranks like a disease. At 3 in the afternoon, the fog returned. This time, it was Mehmed who saw it as the enemy. He ordered a withdrawal. Not a tactical retreat, but a full-blown rout. The Ottomans abandoned equipment, left the wounded behind, and fled the Moldavian church as if chased by ghosts. When silence finally fell over the battlefield, the numbers were impossible to believe. 40,000 Ottoman soldiers had attacked. Only a few hundred Moldavian defenders had held out. Ottoman casualties were estimated at over 15,000 dead or wounded. Moldavian losses? Fewer than 300. Stephen the Great turned a church into the deadliest trap of the 15th century. He won by understanding that the environment is a force multiplier greater than any army. In the months that followed, the victory at the church became legend. Not just in Moldavia, but across Europe. It was living proof that absolute numbers don't guarantee victory when the enemy completely controls the battlefield. The news traveled fast. A Christian prince had defeated the fearsome Ottoman army using engineering, not cavalry. Using strategy, not strength. The long-term impact was profound. For the first time in decades, the Ottomans retreated from a region without conquering it. Mehmed Pasha was recalled to Constantinople in disgrace. The Sultan was furious not just at the defeat itself, but that a single man had humiliated an entire army. The aura of Ottoman invincibility had cracks. More importantly, the battle changed how defensive warfare was thought about. Before Stephen, fortifications were seen as thick walls and high towers. After him, military engineers began to think in depth. Layers of defense, integrated traps, using terrain as an active weapon. The Moldavian church became a case study in military academies for centuries. But here's the secret most people miss. What Stephen did wasn't just win a medieval battle. He used a strategic code you can apply today to win any seemingly impossible challenge. First principle: environmental awareness. Stephen turned every inch into an advantage. Ice broke formations, walls channeled fire. When you can't win with brute force, make the battlefield your ally. This applies today, in business, in politics, in any uneven competition. Don't fight in the opponent's arena. Transform the arena. Use resources the opponent ignores. Make the environment work for you. Second principle: psychological warfare through unexpected resistance. Mehmed expected a quick surrender. Everyone did. A small church shouldn't have lasted a single day against 40,000 soldiers. But Stephen understood that broken expectations do more damage than swords. Each repelled assault didn't just kill Ottoman soldiers, it eroded their confidence. After the fifth failed assault, the troops began to believe the church was invincible. Psychology matters. Sometimes, simply lasting longer than expected is already a victory. Make the opponent doubt their own superiority. Turn confidence into fear. Third principle: resource limitations as engines of innovation. Stephen didn't have 40,000 men. He didn't have heavy cannons. He didn't have massive walls. So he invented solutions large armies never needed to consider. Cannons on mobile sleds. Hollow walls filled with flammable material. Internal compartments with heavy curtains. Each limitation forced creativity. It's counterintuitive, but abundance of resources often kills innovation. When you have everything, you use the obvious solutions. When you have nothing, you must rethink everything. Some of history's best military innovations came from smaller forces fighting empires. Fourth principle: architectural understanding in military planning. Most commanders see buildings as static scenery. Stephen saw the church as a living organism that could be modified to fight alongside him. He understood load-bearing, movement flow, natural choke points. He turned civil engineering knowledge into military advantage. This is cross-specialization. Take expertise from one field and apply it to another. The best strategies often come from combining knowledge that normally wouldn't mix. Now, looking at the bigger picture, what does this story reveal about human capacity under extreme pressure? First, it shows that ingenuity beats brute force when there is sufficient preparation. Stephen didn't improvise in the heat of battle. He spent weeks transforming that church. Every detail was thought through. Every trap tested. The genius was in meticulous preparation, not spontaneous heroics. Second, it demonstrates the power of leveraging asymmetric advantages. The Ottomans had numbers. Stephen had knowledge of the terrain, time to prepare, and the motivation of someone defending his homeland. He didn't try to neutralize Ottoman strength directly. He amplified his own advantages until they outweighed the enemy's numbers. Third, it proves that well-designed systems beat individual talent. It wasn't Stephen alone who won that battle. It was the defense system he built. A system so robust that even ordinary defenders could execute it effectively. The Moldavian soldiers weren't super warriors. They were regular people operating within an exceptional structure. And maybe the most important lesson: resilience is an underrated weapon. The Moldavian defenders fought until their arms went numb. They kept going when it seemed there was no hope. They held their ground when any rational person would have fled. And that absolute refusal to break is what finally broke the Ottomans. Because in the end, sieges aren't won just by who has more soldiers. They're won by who can hold out the longest. And Stephen built a system that could endure indefinitely. The church didn't win by force. It won by outlasting the enemy's expectations. By turning every limited resource into an unexpected advantage. By forcing the Ottomans to fight not an army, but a military puzzle with no obvious solution. Today, when you face impossible odds, remember that church. A small structure of stone and wood that defeated one of the greatest armies in the world. Not because it had more soldiers, not because it had better equipment, but because someone saw possibilities where everyone else saw limits. Stephen didn't ask, "How can I win with what I don't have?" He asked, "How can I make what I do have absolutely lethal?" And that shift in perspective transformed a guaranteed defeat into a legendary victory. 40,000 soldiers, a church, and a genius who saw what no one else could see. That the battlefield isn't where the war happens. The battlefield is the weapon itself, if you know how to use it. What other impossible victories hide ingenious strategies waiting to be discovered? Tell me in the comments which historical battles you want me to analyze in tactical detail. And if this kind of strategic breakdown interests you, subscribe to the channel. Every week I take historical events that seem impossible and show the brilliant engineering behind them. Because history isn't about who had more soldiers. It's about who thought better.